When I graduated high school, I went to Missouri Southern State College to play football there before I went to Bible college. And the summer before, I had worked on the farm for my dad, and I had saved up a few $1,000s to spend there at college, and spend I did. I ate a lot of great pizza and just spent it on a bunch of just really stupid stuff. And I went through Christmas and no problem. But then in the second semester, I started to realize that money has been gone and it is spent. Now, I was living in an apartment off campus, and I didn't have any money to go buy groceries. And so the cupboards were now bare. The fridge is empty, and I was hungry. And so I had to call my mom. My mom and my dad, they sent me $500 every month to cover some of those bills. And so I would pay my rent, I'd pay the bills, and I would go to Walmart and buy food with that. And I realized, a little too late, that $500 didn't quite do that. It would pay the rent, it would pay the bills, but I didn't have enough for food. And so I had to call my mom. Now, I could have called my dad, but your son is hungry. Who are you going to call? You're going to call your mom. So I called my mom and I said, "Hey, Mom, I've run out of money, and the $500 you guys sent, thank you, but it's not quite enough." And she said, "Well, what do you do with all the other money that you made?" And I said, "Well, I'm not, Anyway, and so she said, "Okay, go on." And so I was telling her about it, and I said, honestly, I just need you guys to send money. I will never, for the rest of my life, forget what she said to me that day. My mom, happy Mother's Day, right? My mom said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out." Now that is a rare quality in a mom to these days, isn't it? Her son is hungry, and she said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out." Well, I did, and there was two ways that I figured it out. Number one, I stole food. I found a way into the Missouri Southern cafeteria that they weren't checking, and I would slip in there, and I was hungry. I needed to eat, and so I would sneak into line, and I would steal food out of the cafeteria. Second way is there anybody in here that has given plasma before? I started giving plasma, and I'd get $50 a week, 20 for the first time and 30 for the second time. And so I would get $50, and that was just enough to get some mac and cheese and beans and rice. Have you ever asked for something important but got told no? Of course, yes, we all have. But have you ever asked something important of God and been told no, right? Probably yes, all of us, right? But here's the thing, when you ask something of God, it's probably important. And when He says no, those can be some of the hardest times in our lives. Those can be some of the most challenging times in our lives whenever God says no. Last week, we started the book of Habakkuk. And last week we saw that the question that we posed was, what do you do when God seems absent? Habakkuk is asking God, where are you? How come you're not doing anything? What do you do when God seems absent? Well, today we move forward, and the second question is this, and honestly it's an even harder question, I think, is what do you do when God's answer is worse than His silence? Habakkuk. So if you got your Bibles, I want you to open up to Habakkuk. Habakkuk is talking to God. He is having a conversation to God. It's an interesting book because usually the prophet gets a word from the Lord and then he just shares it with his people. But this is a conversation between Habakkuk and God, and we get to listen in. It's an interesting take on it. But Habakkuk is upset. And he says, Our people don't heed your commands. They have become a people who love conflict and wrongdoing. And why? Why are you allowing this to go on, God? Why? Why aren't you doing anything about it? He says the nation is headed in the wrong direction. It seems like you've heard it said, and maybe you've also said it, that the good old days, are behind us. And Habakkuk is upset that God's just allowing his people to run amok, that his people aren't following the law and doing what's right. And so he's having a conversation between him and God, and we get to listen in. Now, I want you to, last week we went through chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. In verse 5, if you have your Bible, what is the heading above verse 5? Can you see it? The Lord's what? Answer. The Lord's answer. Now, this is interesting because if you remember from last week, Habakkuk says, go back up to verse 2. What does it say there? It says, how long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? You know, he's just saying, how long? How long? You're not listening. You're not answering. How long? And of course, here in verse 5, God answers. But here's the thing. When did he answer? It is obvious from verse 2 that this was not Habakkuk's first prayer, right? How long, O Lord? How long? He's been praying about this for a while. Have you ever prayed for something 10 times? Have you ever prayed for something 100 times and just waited and didn't seem to get an answer? You guys remember whenever Paul had the same issue? He had an issue that he wanted God to answer, to heal him from. Do you guys remember this? Yeah, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in verse 7, he says this, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh. He doesn't say what it was. He says, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, isn't that interesting, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Many people think that this thorn in the flesh was his eyesight, right? We know that Paul had really terrible eyesight. It's interesting. Maybe you guys remember whenever he got converted, what happened to him? The Lord struck him with blindness for 3 days. There may have been something that lingered on because of that. I don't know. But he had poor eyesight. So a lot of people think he's talking about this. It could be anything. We don't know. But whatever it is, he wants healed from it. And it says, Paul says, I prayed 3 times. Now, a lot of us are thinking, 3 times? I mean, what a rook, you know? You're just getting started, you know? But I don't think that's what he's saying. In the Bible, whenever there's 3s, whenever you say that you did something 3 times, it means completeness, right? That he prayed about this completely. He prayed and prayed and prayed until he got an answer. And he wanted God to remove this thorn. And this is the key. I mean, how many of us would say that the first time we prayed about something, we got an answer? I mean, how many of you that prayed something from God to God and you just felt like you got an answer on prayer number 1? You know, maybe we have. But I would say it's probably not the norm. I mean, how many of us would say that we prayed and we prayed and we prayed before we got an answer? I think we all would say that. So I would ask the question, is it fair to say that waiting is actually normal? I mean, here's the truth. Praying and waiting is part of the process. It is part of what matures us as His children. Maturity cannot be rushed. Like yeast that rises bread, it just takes time. But it's worth saying that not everybody who waits matures. Am I right about that? There's one key determinant that differs for people who come away better from their time of waiting and those who come away bitter from their time of waiting. There's one key difference in those people, and it's this: what they believe about God. Because if you believe that God is doing something wrong in your life, if you believe that God might be evil, that He's not a good God, then what does that make you want to do? It makes you want to push away from the table and leave. You don't want to have anything to do with a God like that. But the people who believe that God is good but they just don't understand His reasons. They don't understand why. What does it drive you to do? To lean in. You don't understand. You believe Him to be good, but He's not doing what you want Him to do. And so it drives you to lean in and try to understand what's happening. That's called maturity. That's the key difference. But just like here in Habakkuk, Paul eventually, he does get an answer. And it's in verse 9. And he says this. Here's the answer. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. This was not the answer that Paul was hoping for, but he did eventually get an answer. And Habakkuk had prayed about this many times, and God seemed to be silent, didn't He? How long, O Lord? But eventually, God does give an answer, but God's response is not going to be what he was expecting, or especially what he was hoping. So look with me in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5. He says this, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. And so what is he saying right there? He's bracing Habakkuk for an answer that he's not going to like. He's going to say, hey man, this is going to be tough. I am doing something, but it's going to be tough. And so look in verse 6. He says, I am raising up the Babylonians. I can't overestimate how surprising and how terrifying that sentence would have been to Habakkuk and the people. Just those few words. I am raising up the Babylonians. And he says, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. Habakkuk says to God, he says, listen, things are bad. Things are really bad here. And I don't understand why you're not doing anything. Things are bad in my life and in all of our nation. Why aren't you doing anything? And God answers and He says, I'm doing something. You weren't aware of it, but I've been doing something. I'm raising up a ruthless nation to come and discipline you. I mean, that's going to be a real shock. Habakkuk wants God to change their hearts. Habakkuk wants his people to know God and to serve God again, and that's what his heart. He's a pastor praying for his church, and he's praying for revival, right? And he's asking God to change their hearts, and then God says, I'm going to destroy the nation. He didn't want that. That's not what he wanted. That's not at all. I mean, this has got to seem to Habakkuk, at very best, counterproductive. And at worst, a massive overreaction. I mean, imagine if you were praying to God and your heart was for America. And you cry out to God for revival in America, and you're asking Him to heal the nation, to bring the people back to truth. And God's answer to you was, I hear you, and so I'm going to let the whole economy collapse. The leaders will make decisions that are poor decisions, but they don't know it. I'm going to let you lose your comfort, your stability, and your power. And your nation, all the friends that you had, will now become your enemies. And you will be a stench among the nations. And then when you're vulnerable, a rival nation will attack you when you're weak. This is my plan for you because I'm purifying something deeper. That would be terrifying. That would not be the answer that we were looking for, that we were wanting. And that's what Habakkuk heard. He didn't get relief. He got horror. And so look, he continues on in verse 7. He says, they are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, and their horsemen came from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. They all come on intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind, and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all the fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and goes on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. In other words, he's saying, I'm not ignoring evil. I'm using evil. That just doesn't seem right to us, does it? I mean, it seems off, doesn't it? There's a pastor in Virginia. I read his words last week, and he wrote about, he had a friend, Amy, that was in their church, and Amy was she was amazing. She was a devoted wife and a mother of 3 little children, but she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. And so she and her family just started praying deeply and fervently for her healing. And then, of course, her church gathered around her, and her church would pray and pray and pray for her. But despite the earnest prayers, Amy passed away on a cold January morning. And that heartbreaking outcome left many grappling with the question of why would God say no to such sincere prayers? I mean, I have prayed for healing. I have prayed for others to be healed, and I've prayed fervently, and there was no healing. I've prayed for people to find Jesus, and they just fell further away. Yet friends of mine have prayed for people to be healed, and there was healing and wonderful answers to prayer. And we're left wondering sometimes why does God seem to answer some people's prayers and then other people's He doesn't? Why does He answer our prayers sometimes, but then on other occasions He doesn't? Why does that happen for some or for us at one time and then not another? And Habakkuk is asking the same question that many of us have asked. It's the question of why. I mean, have you asked the question of God, why? I think we all have. Every single person comes to that moment in your life where what you see of God and what you're asking, it just doesn't line up, and you're asking the question of why. And those are hard times in our lives. We don't always understand what is happening. And Habakkuk, he responds to God in verse 12 and 13 of that chapter. Look what he says. He says, Lord, you are you not from everlasting? And then if you go into verse 13, he says, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. In other words, he's saying, God, you are a good God. He knows that God is a good God. And so he's saying, you are good, so why would you let this bad thing happen? Have you ever been there before? And so he's asking. I love Habakkuk because he's not one of those guys that we see very often as quoted very often. I don't know if I've ever heard a sermon series through Habakkuk. But Habakkuk is just a dude like us asking some very hard questions of God that we have all asked. Why? Why are you letting these bad things happen? He says, why do you tolerate the treacherous? And then he says, why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Do you see those? Why? Habakkuk basically says, listen, God, you don't need to tell me how awful these guys are. I know it. What I don't understand is why you're doing this. And what do you do? What do you do? Just like what we talked about last week. What do you do whenever God doesn't answer? Whenever He doesn't seem to be there? What do you do whenever God seems silent? But this week it's, man, what do you do whenever God's answer is worse than His silence? Now, if you know the rest of the story, then you know that God had a reason for doing this. And it was a good reason, but it was going to be painful. All discipline is painful. And he was going to do just that. He loved his people so much that he would not allow them to continue the course that they were going. And so he was sending Babylon down to discipline his children. God agrees with Habakkuk here. They are walking a dangerous path. And like a good father, God is going to correct that path. Now, God was not endorsing Babylon. He was not endorsing evil. He was just using Babylon temporarily. But let me pause for a moment, because I think we need to acknowledge something important here, that not every hardship in your life is God disciplining you. I think we need to understand that. Sometimes terrible things happen, not because it's what's best for us, and not because God is correcting us. We live in a broken world, don't we? And we live in a place where the other people make terrible decisions that affect us. I mean, we live in a place where sickness and injustice and tragedy exist. And in those moments, even when it's not God's discipline, God can still do something in it, though. He can still do something in it. He can meet you in your pain. He can shape you through your loss. And He can bring beauty from the ashes, even when the ashes weren't His doing. So, yeah, Habakkuk's story, in this story, God is disciplining His people. But don't assume that your suffering always means that God is upset with you. But even then, God does not waste it. So here's what ends up happening in their situation. He says, I'm sending Babylon, and Babylon does come. They do come. They come in 605 BC, and then they come again and again, and finally in 586, they finally completely destroyed Jerusalem. And they take almost every single person that was living in Jerusalem. They leave a few, but almost everybody, they exile them all the way back to Babylon. And so these people now are living in a foreign country, in a foreign land, and they are exiled. And they are exiled for 70 years. For 70 years. And then after 70 years, God allows them to come back. And here's what happens. They are a changed people when they come back. The seeds of idolatry were in their hearts. They were worshiping other gods, and they were struggling with that. And you could trace that all the way back to their time in Egypt. Do you remember that? And they never took it out by the roots. It still was in there. And I want to tell you, the sin, or the seeds of sin, if they are left in there, eventually they will grow. And so God used Babylon, that time in Babylon, to rip those seeds of sin out by the roots. And He did something for them because of His love. For God so loved His people that He would not allow them to be lost. So for us, what do we do when God answers, but not in how we hoped? I think it comes down to this. Recognize that God's no is not a neglectful silence, but a loving response. God answered Habakkuk, but He answered him with a tough answer. And Paul asked God over and over to take away his thorn, but God chose not to heal him. And it was ironic that God didn't choose to heal Paul, because Paul had healed many other people. In fact, he raised a boy named Eutychus from the dead, and he is sitting there blind. So how is that loving? God's answer wasn't just a no. Did you notice in the text what it said? It says, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, right? To keep me from becoming prideful, I was given a thorn in my flesh. Paul struggled with pride. So God blessed him with a no. I wonder how many of those blessings we see as curses. God's answer may not fix your situation, but it will form your soul. The second part of God's answer to Paul was this, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. The answer for Paul was a no, but it was because that was what was best for Paul. The theological truth is this, that God always answers the cries of His people, but often not when we want, not how we want, or how we expect. And that's okay if you trust Him more than you trust yourself. Last week I told you that at the dinner table, I had asked probably one of the stupidest questions I have ever asked as a father. And I had asked my children, I said, is there anything that I have done wrong as a father? Why do you even ask that question? But something even worse happened. My daughter actually chose to answer the question. Rude. After I said this in my sermon last week, a couple of people asked me, they were like, well, what did she say? What was wrong? Well, I'll tell you. She is upset, and she thinks I'm doing this wrong, that brace yourself, it's going to be bad. Okay, here we go. I limit her screen time. I know. Abuse. Don't call just yet. But I limit her screen time. She does not like that. And in fact, she told me very confidently that she would never limit her own kids' screen time whenever she has kids. I said, well, I think you might change your mind whenever you get to be a parent. And she said, I am so confident. Whose child is this? This is her mother's child. I'm so confident that I will not do it, that I will give you $100 if I ever do that. Now, we have several attorneys in here. I need a contract written up real quick and notarized right now. Now, obviously, if I ask you a question, do you think that she'll change her mind about that someday? And all of you guys are going to say, of course. But right now, she can't see that, and that's okay. Why is it okay that she can't see that? Because God has made for teenagers, He has made the emotional part of their brain to develop before the rational part. And that's not a joke, that's just how it is. So therefore, our teenagers don't think rationally before they think emotionally. That's okay. I don't expect her to understand what I understand. Could it be the same for us? Could it be the same that we might not understand what God understands? Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9, I hate them. I hate those two verses in the Bible. I wish they would take them out. I want to take a marker and mark through them. But here's what they say. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. In other words, God knows better than me. Listen, Charlie thinks that we're limiting her joy. But what are we doing? We're protecting her soul. That's what God's no often is. It's not punishment, but it's protection. So remember this, God is not picking on you. Please hear me. God is not picking on you. God is not ignoring you. He is working even when you don't see or understand it. And number 2 is this, grieve honestly and then trust deeply. Both Habakkuk and Paul wrestled honestly before they got their answer. And that kind of disappointment in your life, it has 2 paths that lead from it. When you are disappointed with God, there's 2 paths. And the first path is a path of maturity in faith. But there's also a path that walks away from the Lord. And remember what Paul said. He said this, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses. Remember this, that there is room in your faith for disappointment. But the end of disappointment doesn't have to be despair. It can be dependence. And when we become dependent on God, we become mature in faith. Some of you guys know our good friend Marita Beatty, who lost her husband Dennis, and it was exactly 1 year ago last Sunday. And she said that she wrote on a sticky note a sentence that helped her so much in her time of hardship, and it just said simply this. She said, "What does faithfulness look like today?" When you trust in God, but you're struggling, just focus on what is the next right thing. What does faithfulness look like today? And number 3 is this: shift from fix-it prayers to form me prayers. When we don't get the answer that we want, God is using the situation to form something in us rather than fix something around us. Paul stopped asking for the thorn to go away, and he started boasting in it because he saw what God was doing. Maybe our requests aren't nearly as important as our resilience and our humility and our trust through them. A simple but profound tweak to our prayers would be this: God, I'm asking for this. Keep asking. Keep asking. I'm asking for this, but I'm trusting you to shape me, even if it's a no. Ryan and Ashley Posey, a couple in our church, they have known a thing or two about not getting the answer that they wanted from their prayers. They've hit a hard road before, and they were deeply asking God to fix a hard thing in their life. They remain faithful through it all. Check this out.
So I met my husband Ryan in 2001. In college, we dated for 14 months, and we were engaged for 14 months, and we got married in June of 2004. Moved back to Chickasha, started plugging into the community, serving at New Life, and in early 2006, we started trying to get pregnant. So time goes on, we're about a year down the road, and no pregnancy, no baby. And at that time, my OBGYN suggested, you might follow up with like a fertility doctor and run some tests and kind of see what's going on. And so through all of that, long story short, we determined that I had a combination of issues that were going to make it really difficult for me to get pregnant. And so we went down the road with our doctor, and about 6 months into fertility treatments, we got pregnant in September of 2007. And a few weeks later, miscarried that pregnancy. So that was a really painful time for me in a lot of ways. And I know I've talked to a lot of women who have experienced pregnancy loss, and that is, you fall in love the minute you find out you're pregnant. So we thought this was our miracle. We thought this was our answered prayer. And it didn't turn out to be. So at that point in time, Ryan and I just kind of took a step back from everything from the doctor's visits and just everything, and we just took a step back and decided we're going to pray about this and just try to see, like, are we really in the center of God's will for our life and our family? And then in May of 2008, I can vividly remember Mother's Day at New Life in 2008, just sobbing through the whole service. It was really just, Mother's Day can be such a difficult holiday, I think, when you're trying to get pregnant and you're struggling, or you've had pregnancy loss. And so that's just such a vivid memory for me. And the days and weeks and months, that season, when I look back, it just felt so long, like it felt so slow. It just felt like time was dragging. And so when I look back at that season of waiting and feeling like God was really quiet, I know He wasn't, and we knew He was working at the time for sure, but it definitely felt like He was just very quiet. And so a verse that became really like my life verse during that time, that it's one of my favorites to this day, and it's found in James 1:2-4, and it says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let endurance finish its work in you, making you mature and complete, lacking in nothing." And So when I look back at that season of infertility that I experienced and the pain and the questioning and like, why are we going through this? It really, that verse kind of like jolted me like, okay, even though the prayers aren't being answered like I want them to be, and we're not seeing the miracle, I'm still called to have joy even in that. And that was just so transformational for me. And I look back on that time, I'm so grateful that God had grace with me, that he was patient with my impatient heart, and that he allowed me to go through that so he could mature me and get me to trust in him even more.
I just want to echo those last words that she said. She said, that was just so transformational for me. And I look back on that time and I'm so grateful that God had grace with me. That he was patient with my impatient heart. And that he allowed me to go through that so that he could mature me and get me to trust in him even more. Listen, Habakkuk prayed for help and he got horror. Paul prayed for healing and he got hardship. But here's what they discovered. God's no is never cruel. His answer may hurt. It may shake us, but it will never destroy us. Listen, if you're in a place where your cupboards are bare, your fridge is empty, or your spirit is weak, and your prayers feel unanswered, when you're in doubt, keep trusting. Because the one who gives the answer is still good. Let me pray.